Hi everyone, my name is Michael Binder. For my essay, I chose to write about the different ethnic groups of Singapore with a specific focus on the Malay population. I found Singapore to be interesting because they're considered a multicultural society, and their government employs what they call a CMIO model, which stands for the Chinese, Malay, Indian, other. And I also found the Malay population interesting specifically because they kind of have a varied past in Singapore with a history of rulers and large communities and kind of Malay favoritism by colonizers, which kind of shifted. And actually, today, even though Malays are considered to be the indigenous group of Singapore, the current population is the majority of the current population of Malays in Singapore have ties to other countries like Indonesia, Java, Sumatra, Malay Peninsula, and other areas that kind of came in throughout mostly throughout the mid to late 1800s and into the 1900s. So yeah, I want to talk about the CMIO model in a little bit, but first I want to kind of talk about the history of colonial Singapore leading to into independence and into modern times. Um, so Singapore was colonized in the early to mid 1800s by the English, led by the explorer Sir Thomas Raffles. Who developed a free port, and in one article I read, I heard the community that he kind of developed described as enlightened compared to other colonized countries, I guess. And so that was kind of what brought a lot of the non-indigenous Malays into Singapore at that time. And British colonists and British soldiers kind of considered or kind of favored the Malays over the other indigenous groups, primarily being the Chinese and the Indians. And so they were kind of preferentially recruited for government jobs, and by the early 1900s, heavily dominated the workforce in Singapore, specifically the government jobs. And that continued through until about the 1960s and 70s, around the time when Singapore gained independence from the British. And when that happened, the new ruling government kind of saw the disproportionately Malay workforce and decided they kind of needed to do something about that. They kind of wanted to balance the scales to more accurately represent the current population of that time, which meant kind of replacing a lot of the Malays in the workforce by Chinese workers. But that attempt to kind of balance the scales maybe went a little too far, and with increasing importance of being able to speak English for business and commerce and that kind of thing. The education rates and as well as employment rates among the Malay population kind of started to drop. And this, by the late 70s, in the early 80s, this kind of had a pretty detrimental effect on the Malay population of Singapore. And so in 1981, a foundation was formed called Mendaki, which is an acronym which translates to Council for the Education of Muslim Children. And that, as well as other programs, ended up being fairly successful and kind of balancing the scales. And so I want to kind of talk about, real quick, the CMIO model in modern time or contemporary Singapore. And I think the general consensus, especially among Singaporeans, is that the CMIO model has worked for the most part and kind of fostered a sense of respect towards other cultures and ethnicities. But what people are kind of, or maybe kind of have been saying, but are saying more now, even more now, is that this sense of multiculturalism and acceptance is a little potentially superficial, and that even though in public spaces and in just kind of your day-to-day interactions, most people treat each other with respect and kind of get along pretty well, but there are still thought to be many underlying prejudices, and one of the thoughts behind this is that because people kind of see Singapore already as a successfully multicultural society, that kind of suppresses any real discussion about whether or not this model is still working or is going to be as effective in the future. So that was kind of interesting to learn about. And I don't think they have an answer yet, but or maybe never will. But in one documentary I was watching, something that kind of stuck with me or caught my interest was the idea that they need to, instead of